Should the Jazz make a trade to move up and get someone that will not be there at 10? Find out next on Locked On Jazz.
You are Locked On Jazz, your daily podcast on the Utah Jazz. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hello and welcome into Locked On Jazz. You guys know me. I'm Leif Thulin. I'm excited to be back with you guys on one of the final days that I'll be with you, and this one is live from the NBA Combine. If you hear that music, that's because there's pro days of maybe future Jazzmen out there, one of whom is Dalton Connect practicing right now. We're doing a walkthrough for his pro day. If you hear the squeaking of shoes, got plenty of stars walking around the lobby, but I found an alcove to record this. But I am a Jazz fan for life, locked on NBA Big Board attendee of the 2023 and now 2024 NBA Combine, Jazz broadcast assistant and statistician the past 3 seasons, and lover of college hoops along with the NBA. So I'm going to give you a lot of analysis on these prospects who could become Jazzman in the future. And I'm excited to make you guys as knowledgeable about the draft as possible so you know about who the Jazz are getting. Thanks for making Locked On Jazz your first listen every day. And remember, Locked On Jazz is free and available on all platforms, including YouTube at Locked On Jazz, where the best way to help us grow is to comment anything below. Today's question is it worthwhile to trade up in this draft, even if it's considered not a great draft at the top, if you found your guy? And maybe Danny Ainge has just done just that. So in the first segment, I'll explain which players at the Combine may have moved their stocks up to a point the Jazz cannot get them at 10. In the second segment, I'll explain a trade that could make it possible to get up to the spot in the draft where you could get that player. And I'll explain the final segment. I'll discuss a rumor in the final segment that the Jazz are pursuing Miles Bridges of the Charlotte Hornets and explain how that could happen and do I like that move for the Utah Jazz. All coming up next on Locked On Jazz. So let's dive right in. I think the wings in this draft are kind of where the Jazz are going to target. Like, that's the strength of who is going to be available at 10, whether the Jazz end at 8, like everyone assumed based off the pre-lottery odds. That's kind of who the Jazz are going to target. But maybe it's lower on the ranking scale of who is available at 10. Is it the 5th wing out of the kind of, there's 5 big wings I think are going to be available, picks 4 through 10. Maybe the Jazz get the 5th right there. I think that there's probably a few players that have played their way based on just shooting drills and or measurements that may have improved their own stock simply by shooting well or testing taller than maybe expected or worried that they would not. And there's one guy that I think is now projected too high for the Jazz to reach at 10. And I think it would have taken him to shoot terribly to fall that far, but he measured well and shot well. That's national champion Stephon Castle, who in UConn's run to the national championship and in the title of winning it all allowed for Jazz fans to familiarize themselves with this game. And there was one glaring deficiency, and it was probably still is the shot. That said, Matas Buzelis really struggled in shooting drills on Monday, and the form did not look good. Ron Holland performed adequately but did not shoot it well, and Cody Williams struggled. Both his form looked fine, but his shot did not rotate very well and shot very poorly. Stephon Castle, who is also ruled out analytically on being a good shooter in the long run, according to some of the metrics Locke ran through for the past 6 years, and they've been incredibly accurate historically. Stephon Castle was certainly concerning, but he shot well. He made 18 of 25 threes. His form had a bit of a dip, and the ball dipped just a touch and did not take it. He did not take it at full speed, and he kind of had a wrist happy follow through where he flicked his wrist and generated tons of backspin. But he made shots, and he made sure to take his time, read the laces, and shoot the ball in. Wasn't necessarily game speed, not pure shooting like Dalton Connect or Reed Shepherd, but he made 18 of 25 threes, which is of the same caliber of those two guys I just mentioned prior, who are among the best shooters in this class, if not the best shooters. Castle initially had his measurements messed up as well, and he was labeled as having the same measurements that actually belonged in reality to Providence's Devin Carter, eliciting worry that he was shorter and maybe these numbers were all inflated and now you're getting a smaller guard. But in fact, Castle measured in at a very well at nearly 6'5" without shoes and about 6'7" in shoes with a 6'9" wingspan. And you all know how well he defended the ball, the tenacity. And if he shot well and measured well, I think that might move him out of the Jazz's reach. For those curious, here's what Castle is according to something put together by Jonathan Wasserman, just a career evaluation. This is what the role he can be. And I thought it was interesting talking about the scalability both immediately and in the long term to the NBA. And this is what he says, and I quote, "He'll likely start his career operating as a Josh Hart, like Swiss Army knife, the type who will move the ball, drive, make hustle plays, and lock down defensively. But he played more point guard in high school, and he was used in plenty of ball screens at Connecticut. There's some enticing on-ball upside with his size and strength, particularly if he can improve his pull-up. The Big East Freshman of the Year averaged 11.1 points, 4.7 rebounds, and 2.9 assists per game in the season, winning the national championship for the Huskies. So I think that's interesting. Josh Hart is not necessarily the comparison I would go. I think he's a popular comparison considering how well he's played in the playoffs and the notoriety of the New York Knicks. He's a player I've long coveted for the Utah Jazz, and I think in given years, the Josh Hart type could have really elevated the Jazz to a team that lost in the second round to a team that could have contended for championships. Castle has that same appeal of not being a star, but a star in his role, and I think that's an interesting comparison, even if they're not one and the same. I think Hart is more of a small forward, and Castle's more of someone who can play point guard. I've voiced my concerns about Castle before in the sense that maybe UConn maximized him in the sense that they just had a player similar like Andre Jackson, and they knew how to play a non-shooting guard with athletic qualities. But Castle did play pick and roll well, knew how to do so, and if his shot turns out to be NBA level, which I think it can based on what I saw and the rapid improvements from the college basketball season to what I saw live here at Wintrust Arena in Chicago, I buy it. Here are some strengths and weaknesses for those of you unfamiliar with his game. He's a high field playmaker who controls tempo by playing at his own pace. He'll change rhythm and can decelerate with ease, showcasing excellent body control and strength. And with his size and strength, that's all there. He can plow through defenders too, along with using some of that craftiness to get to the rim. He makes simple plays with skip passes, kickouts, drop-offs, and he's able to find Klingon on the interior many, many times. With spacing in the NBA, he should thrive in the pick and roll more like he did at the high school level as a point guard when his playmaking was far more emphasized than it was at UConn, being a freshman on a team with a first-team All-American point guard in Tristan Newton. He's also a good finisher through contact at the rim using either hand to do it. He catches, I wouldn't say fire, but he gets hot while shooting threes, and he showed potential when he knocked down shots that he had the confidence to keep shooting them. Even though UConn had a ton of offensive weapons, he never found his way to being the guy, but he would sometimes know, hey, you know what, I can do that. I'm that dude. And he was extremely confident in interviews when we talked to him and just was very outspoken about belief in his abilities, and he was playing a role at UConn. So that gives me some faith. Now, I also think he displays some soft touch when he goes to the rim on intermediate shots, on floaters and layups. I don't think there's that much of a mechanical issue. I think that's a little bit wrist happy, like I said. But here's an interesting stat. Over his first 15 games at UConn, he made 69% of free throws. Since then, after his first 15, he made about 90%. So I think his free throw percentage is better than maybe some would anticipate. And then defensively, he's an excellent defender. Like he really is. Now, what are the negatives? He doesn't have a calling card as a playmaker. Can he be a playmaker? Is he a great shooter? What is his role? And while we talk about, hey, he can be like a Josh Hart, who that was one of his questions. What is his role? An undersized guy who's a rebounder more than he is a shooter. Well, Castle's not quite a point guard. He's not quite a shooter. And so there's a lot of good skills, but he's not great at any one thing. I think that is a negative, but it's a negative by being good at a few things, but not a good at a few things, but a master of no traits. He also missed a bit of the season to begin the season with a meniscus injury. So there is a medical history. All right, back to the ideas on board. To me, as I said, he doesn't have the makings of a star, but I said in this draft it's less about getting a star and more about assuring you can nab a high-end role player. And Castle measuring well, shooting it better than expected, and being an immediate positive on the defensive end. I believe if he was not already, he is firmly now out of the reach of the Utah Jazz, but they could be interested and have the pieces should they like, because there's some doubt that the Jazz will draft 3 times at 10, 29, and 32. So maybe they find Stephon Castle, and that's their guy in a draft where there's not a ton of stars. The Jazz believe that they can find a guy that will impact them positively, and maybe more teams, because there aren't those supposed stars, would be more willing to trade. Well, coming up next, I'll explain how the Jazz can make a deal to acquire Stephon Castle or someone higher up. But first, let me tell you about eBay Motors. Passion, drive, and patience. The formula for winning championships is also what keeps your ride or die alive. eBay Motors has everything you need to maintain your vehicle and level it up to peak performance. Superchargers, roof racks, exhaust kits, LED headlights, and more. Whether you're into speed, power, or style, eBay Motors has you covered. With over 122 million parts for your number one ride or die, you'll always find exactly what you're looking for. And with eBay Guaranteed Fit, your part is guaranteed to fit your ride every time or your money back. Because with eBay Motors, you're burning rubber, not cash. With all the parts you need at the prices you want, it's easy to make your car the MVP and bring home huge wins. Keep your ride or die alive at ebaymotors.com. Eligible items only. Exclusions apply. eBay guaranteed fit. Only available to U.S. customers. Welcome back to Locked On Jazz. I'm Leif Thulin with you here from Wintrust Arena in Chicago, the home of the NBA Combine. I got one more question for you guys, though. Are you guys watching Fox Sports or ESPN on your TV all day long, and you have to turn down the volume with all that shouting? Make the switch to Locked On Sports today, a free 24/7 sports streaming channel program for you every day to bring you the biggest stories without screaming. Locked On Sports Today brings you can't-miss analysis, opinions, news, streaming 24/7 on YouTube or the free Amazon Fire TV's channels app. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. All righty, back here on Locked On Jazz, I'm Leif Thulin, attending the NBA Combine. That's what you hear behind me. The Combine carries on, and you heard there are plenty of enticing options at 29 and 32 who performed well at the Combine. I mentioned my favorite guy that I think should be gone by then, but if he's there, Baylor Shireman. He had another good showing today here at the Combine. A couple other players moved their names up, but do the Jazz really want to have 6 players drafted within the past 2 years, likely under 20 years old, on their roster? Well, the draft lover in me would love to see that, but I kind of doubt the Jazz actually do that. I have seen Danny Ainge, Will Hardy, Ryan Smith, plenty of scouts that I recognize from meeting them in the past couple of years working for the Jazz, along with attending the Combine and interacting with them. The personnel from the media side are separated from the teams, but you can see them. And the Jazz have the largest contingent of any of the teams here, and you have them at the head man. Will Hardy is also here with Danny Ainge, and it makes me feel good. It makes me feel like they have something brewing, that they know who they want. Why this matters is not every GM or high-ranking executive is watching live at the Combine. I think Ainge kind of knows who he wants. He seems to have this sly grin in his, and every time I see him, he seems to be musing. And I feel confident for some reason. I don't know if it's justified confidence, but it is how I feel. Now, can he get the guy the Jazz want? Can the Jazz get that player at 10, or do the Jazz have to spin some wheels, make some magic happen, and trade up to get there? It's doable that the Jazz could get the guy at 10. Why that's possible is I think Cody Williams, Matas Buzelis, and Ron Holland did not shoot it well. Dalton Connect is older, so those 4 wings right there could fall for those reasons. But Castle shooting it well either makes it impossible to get, or Ainge is smiling ear to ear as he knows other teams will go for him, and maybe his guy will fall to him. Regardless of who the Jazz want, I don't think it's crazy that Jazz could trade up. Listening to Ryan Russillo a while ago, he was saying that the market for the number 1 pick is a player of the caliber of like Lou Dort, and he thought that Derek White is someone who's untouchable. And what that means is that those guys are good players on top seeds of their respective conferences for the Thunder and Celtics respectively, but they're 4th or 5th starters on a really good team. That's not typically the market for a number 1, which means that you can trade in with those type of established players to get a player now, or you could trade up picks in a draft, and I think that maybe it's a little less enticing this year than other years, but the Jazz also have assets in future years, so remember that when you're thinking about these trades. I do think the Jazz have a few players around that threshold that are of the Lou Dort ilk or the Derek White ilk, that I think those guys are probably better than what the Jazz have or are willing to dangle. They do have players around that threshold, and along with 2 picks later in the draft and, of course, number 10 and assets to boot. I think the Jazz have the luxury of being selective and not having the success of the franchise hinge on this year's lottery pick, because the future of the Jazz isn't reliant on this draft, as the Jazz have future draft assets and an already young nucleus with a player that they likely will be able to extend in the offseason in Lowry Markkanen. I've talked myself into the Jazz not wanting 3 new rookies this year, and I believe Ainge can be aggressive because he has the luxury of the lack of pressure and can make the moves he sees fit. Because there are pieces to be found in this draft, if you know what your team is searching for, I think there's a real reason to try to trade up, because teams might be more willing to trade as they don't necessarily love the picks, and there's a lot of pressure associated with taking these high-end picks if you don't necessarily love a player and you don't have the conviction with taking of these players. And I think there's going to be plenty of teams that feel that way, whether they voice that or publicly or not. If that piece is indeed Stephon Castle, I think the Jazz would have to jump to around 4 or 5. But if he's taken higher, some of those coveted wings then drop. So I would not expect a trade till around draft night, if not on draft night, as Ainge can then survey the board and make some moves to best position the Jazz to get the guy they want for the cheapest in return. In years past, Danny Ainge did this with Jason Tatum, selecting him at 3, even though they had the number 1, knowing that Fultz was Philly's pick. and Lonzo Ball was going to be a Laker at 2, so he strategically positioned himself saying, I don't know who we're going to take. Let's move down to 3 because we think there's 3 really good candidates, and he got the best player of that bunch. And I can see a trade in the horizon. It just feels like there's writing on the wall. Now the question would be, would 10, 29, and 32 get the Jazz a top 5 pick? My guess would be no. But maybe a team doesn't like a fit for themselves at 5, and they don't deem it worth picking at 5, and they can get added value of an established player like the Jazz have. Or maybe they see extra picks and they say, well, you know what? They have more chances to hit a few singles by getting a few different players rather than hinge a lot of the success of the franchise of the future on a player in the top 5. So a team I've thought of an opportunity to make a trade would be, I would look at Houston as 3 as a potential trade partner because they have the vast majority of their nucleus is in place. They're already young, but they need to get players that they think are ready to win now. And I don't know if they necessarily have that piece. A lot of rumors say that they're tied to Donovan Clingan. Well, Alperen Sengun's their best player going forward, in my opinion. And that leaves you some redundancy, even though they're different. They're both not necessarily great shooters, and while Sengun's tremendously skilled, I think that limits your upside offensively with a lack of floor spacing. That's irrelevant to this discussion, but they do have pieces in place, and maybe they don't need to want to rely on a rookie as heavily as they would if they took a pick at 3. Now, they probably wouldn't want 3 first, but maybe 10 and a player such as Jordan Clarkson, or maybe 10-29 Jordan Clarkson gives the Jazz a chance to get it to 3 and maybe draft Stephon Castle if that is indeed the guy the Jazz want. I think that's possible. I could also envision a world in which the Hornets would not mind moving down from 6 with a chance to get a wing they very easily could deem to be of the same caliber of the guy that they would be picking at 6 anyway. They could easily get the same player at 10 that they could get at 6, and they have youngsters. They don't have anyone really in place, and extra picks doesn't necessarily hurt them like it does some teams where guaranteed contracts are a stupendous thing to have, and you want to have the best players on the roster. I think the Hornets have the position where they could get 3 new rookies and be happy and see it build internal competition, see who's going to flourish alongside Brandon Miller, potentially LaMelo Ball, and a few of the other young pieces that are proving to be bright spots on what's been a unfortunate franchise in the last couple of years. They've really struggled. Okay, another team that I would be interested in would be Portland. They have a lot of guards who like the ball in their hands. So if a guard like Castle's there, I expect the Jazz to be assertive as I think Ainge has a plan. Personally, I like the idea of being aggressive and capitalizing on the uncertainty of this draft, especially with next year serving as more of a pivotal draft. I like the mindset of going and getting what you like more than sitting back and playing the board because, as we've discussed, there are a few slam dunks to be, even singles, much less doubles and home runs. So if there is one to be had, I say pounce if the board falls conducively to this vision. I don't hate the idea of swinging at 10, going for a home run if a less certain lower floor, high ceiling guy falls, because everyone's going to be cautious and taking high floor guys and as opposed to high ceiling guys. But I prefer this method of going and getting your guy rather than trying to play the board. It is a little bit of a high risk, but I think the Jazz have the chances and the luxury to try to go for it because they have assets in future drafts. And I think the Jazz don't want to be all that great next year, frankly. And if they were to get someone that's really good, maybe you can accelerate the process. But you still have to go get that really good player in order to do so. Well, coming up next, we're going to talk about trades or just acquisitions in general. I'll react to a rumor that is starting to swirl that the Jazz have been making a move to try to acquire former top 10 pick Miles Bridges of the Charlotte Hornets. And we'll hash that out coming up next. But first, a word from BetterHelp. This episode is brought to you by BetterHelp. Sometimes all we need is the opportunity to get something off of our chest. Big or small, certain things that can really start to get to you. It's important to let that out, especially to someone who's unbiased on your life. For example, I could tell you how I really and truly feel about who the Jazz should draft, but sometimes that's not all that is on one's mind, and you still need a kind and unbiased audience all the same. Therapy can be different for everyone. Most of us have bigger problems than our favorite sports team, and it's important to get those same things off of your chest once in a while, if not more often than that. If you're thinking of starting therapy, give BetterHelp a try. It's entirely online, designed to be flexible and suited to your schedule. Visit BetterHelp.com/LockedOnNBA to get 10% off your first month. That's BetterHelp, HELP.com/LockedOnNBA. Welcome back to Locked On Jazz. I'm Leif Thulin, recording here live from Chicago at the NBA Combine after both scrimmages have concluded. And while free agency talk seems to be on the back burner because of the NBA Combine and the NBA playoffs. There are plenty of sources linking the Jazz to trying to acquire Miles Bridges. So let's explore that possibility. Jazz rumors were published as follows. According to NBA Michael Scott, according to Hoops Hype, an NBA site, and then the guy who wrote this named Michael Scotto, the Jazz have emerged as one of many squads with interest in the Hornets forward before free agency. With forward Miles Bridges entering unrestricted free agency, it's uncertain whether he'll return as a member of Charlotte's core. The Hornets, Detroit Pistons, and Utah Jazz are among the notable teams expected to have interest in Bridges during free agency, league sources told Hoops Hype. Bridges finished with 21 points per game, 7.3 rebounds, 3.3 assists on 46.2 from the field, 34.9 from three, 82.5 from the free throw line, shooting splits. With the Jazz's cap space and a need for a wing depth, the fit would make sense on paper if there weren't any outlying questions regarding his fit on the team after his legal issues. That's what Michael Scotto wrote. And it makes sense. There's no denying that you can see the production, though I deem it empty calorie scoring on a bad team for part of it. But players like that have thrived on winning situations before. Andrew Wiggins would be an example of this, where he scored a lot for the Timberwolves, and while he's of a different talent than Bridges is, but when he went to the Warriors, they repurposed him, used his athletic traits, became a rebounder and a defensive stopper, and he was integral in winning a championship. Even Aaron Gordon, talented, but his numbers didn't really mean much when he was in Orlando. Goes to Denver, and he's vital on a team that is vying for repeating as champions. These type of players with athletic traits and ability to produce can be scaled down on winning teams and really matter. Now, I know the Jazz aren't really the winning team yet, but I want to point out that while it's empty calorie scoring, there's talent level, and he's young, and his contract will be tame compared to his talent level, and he doesn't have much room to say, I don't want to go here, as he may otherwise, if Utah's often regarded as not having much of a chance to get these type of talents. Well, beggars can't be choosers, as his legal issues have put him in a bit of a predicament. Bridges fits the timeline without enormously accelerating the Jazz in the short term. What I mean by that is he's still young enough to build and grow with the team, but he's not good enough by himself to move you out of the timeline that you're kind of building and hopefully building around the number 8 pick or the top 8 protected pick next year should the Jazz not be very good. And if they hit a home run in the draft and they get Bridges and they're out of the top 8, well, that home run makes you have the chance to have your star with you. Obviously, you want a chance in the 2025 draft because it's deemed as excellent. But you, once again, beggars can't be choosers. I personally think much of this decision about if the Jazz do pursue Bridges would depend on if John Collins is still on the roster, as I think they are somewhat redundant as big-time athletes with iffy consistency from three and are better on offense than defense, and both kind of play different positions on offense than defense. Bridges is a 3 on offense, tries to play a 4 on defense. Collins is a 5 on offense that plays a 4 on defense. Not necessarily conducive to team success, especially together. Now, if Collins is gone and Bridges does not cost an arm and a leg, I don't despise the idea of buying low on a talented player. But I do think, I also do not think he's necessarily a winning player. I do think he can be transformed into more of a winning player than he's been allowed to showcase, because Charlotte has kind of been a laughing stock in terms of developing winning players. And you can have players turn into winning players if they have the right environment. But I want to say that so far in his career, he is not a winning player, and I think there are empty calorie stats more than the actual production. And then furthermore, and probably more importantly, I don't think he's necessarily a winning player, but obviously his legal issues are very, very real and saddening and concerning. So there would be significant research needed to be done on the Jazz's part to see if he's worthwhile to sign. But I wanted to address these rumors of a notable player going to the Utah Jazz, and there's significant links tying the two. The Jazz, as I mentioned in my free agency primer, I'd prefer to look at Gary Trent or even a veteran like Nick Batum for cheaper, with more safety involved, less risk involved, taking a guy like Bridges both on the legal side plus on the basketball side where he'd be paid more. I think Gary Trent, you could pay a similar amount, and he fits the timeline even better than Bridges does without risking accelerating the curve and or having issues that are behind the scenes and not necessarily on a basketball court. Okay, well, that's something to think about. Let me know what you guys think about that trade, because that's kind of my thoughts. I think he's a solid player. And now if the Jazz don't have John Collins and maybe a guy like Clarkson's on the move, and you need to replace a player and you need to replace production, buying low on Bridges would be fantastic, strictly from a basketball perspective. That said, I don't know how much I really think he impacts winning, Now, the Jazz don't necessarily need to win right now. And if you have Miles Bridges along with Lowry, Markkanen, Walker Kessler, a draft pick to come, Taylor Hendricks, you start to like your chances athletically. You look good. There's a lot of wings that can do things. Like, that's what the Jazz prioritize. Big wings that can do things. Well, that does fit Danny Ainge's motto and ideas, but I have my reservations, as I've said. I prefer the Gary Trent ilk more so than the Miles Bridges. Well, the other thing that I want to preface is the Jazz, the amount of picks that they will select also tells me how serious they are about acquiring Bridges or another wing in free agency, because telling Jazz fans more about the desired timeline is exactly what the Jazz would be doing by saying, hey, we're taking 3 picks. To me, that means that the Jazz would be saying, yeah, we're throwing in the towel on trying to win this season. And maybe that's for the better, because the Jazz kind of didn't do that the last 2 years. They went half in, half out, and I think it cost them. And yes, you could say, oh, the Hawks won the lottery because they got lucky, and maybe we could do that. So there's no reason to truly tank, but percentages would tell you need to and have a decision. But if the Jazz were to take 3 rookies this year and have 6 guys from the past 2 drafts, I think it would tell you that the Jazz are considering building around the youth movement, re-signing Markkanen, and deciding which players survive through the internal competition of having that much youth, make it out of the camps, and win, and are willing to help us put in the hours as Jazz fans. And the Jazz team will end up determining which guys are the best for winning down the road. Is it Keontae George? Is it Lowry Markkanen? And is it those young rookies to come? Well, that's what it would tell me. Whereas if the Jazz only take 1 pick, I think it means it's more likely that the Jazz decide to try to win sooner rather than later. And whether that's good in the long run, I don't know. Whether they go for Miles Bridges or another wing in free agency, I think it does tell the Jazz what the desired timeline is and how the 2024-2025 season will go, as the Jazz last year, as I said, and the year prior had indecision about how to play the past 2 seasons. I mean, they started out poorly, 7-19, and we were 26-26, and it cost the Jazz in terms of the chances of getting a top-end pick. But maybe in this class you say, well, it doesn't matter as much. Well, next year probably will if there's a Cooper flag on the table. So I think the Jazz likely keep their picks or maybe consolidate 29 and 32 into one other one, because I think there's a chance that they buy low on good players that are seen as reclamation projects like Miles Bridges, like Gary Trent, because that's too good of a value to not go for. And it would just be weird to not go for someone that as talented as those guys are when you're picking 29 and 32. But I do think that is indicative of how the Jazz will go. If they pick at those picks, I think it tells the Jazz the timeline. And I think if they pursue a Miles Bridges to complement Lowry Markkanen, and maybe they go for other trades and the Jazz are fast tracking it. Let me know what you guys think about that assessment, how real that is, and also what you guys think of, should they go after a guy like Miles Bridges? Should they go after a Gary Trent? Along with, should they move up in the draft, consolidate assets in order to get a guy like Stephon Castle? And if it's not Stephon Castle for you guys, who is your preference to go up and try to trade for if there is a dude in this class? Let me know in the comments. Thanks for listening, and I'll be back with you one more time on this from Chicago for an episode from the Combine. But I appreciate you guys for listening as always. And Locked On, I just want to remind you guys, Locked On has launched the first ever national sports 24/7 streaming channel on YouTube. And now it's also available on Amazon Fire TV and the free Fire TV channels app. Locked On Sports Today is here for you 24/7, covering the top sports stories of the day with local experts of Locked On, plus our national shows covering every single league. Find Locked On Sports Today, now available on the free Fire TV channels app. Thanks for listening. And as always, make sure to support your Jazz. Go Jazz. And I can't wait to see what happens in the draft. Thank you guys for listening.